Along with learning watercolors, I also realized that knowing how to use your paints and brush is equally important. When you start, always activate your paint by dropping in drops of water to the paint that you would like to use. This is known as activating the paint, and then it is ready to use. For a soft, translucent mix, add drops of water on your palette. You can then take a little bit of that activated paint and mix it to get a very translucent layer. As you add more and more paint to this mix, the pigment is more saturated and you end up with a much more opaque layer. Now the basic brush drills. You can start with painting thin lines. This takes a little bit of practice if you've never used a brush before. I like to drag my brush gently across the paper. Notice that my hand is on the tabletop, and that's why it is easy for me to drag the brush. My hand is not in the air, and that gives it a little bit more of sturdiness for me to control my brush movement. For the thin lines, I'm making sure my brush is perpendicular to the paper and just the tip is brushing through the paper. The next exercise is pressing down your brush and gently lifting it up. This is very useful for painting leaves and flowers. So pressing down your brush and gently lifting it up. You can see how that brush is at a 90 degrees, and then I press it down and then lift it so just the tip touches the paper, and then pressing it down, and so on. Now this is something you can use to also create thick lines. So pressing down your brush, you can create thicker lines, and the width of these lines depends on the width of your brush. So here you can see my brush is fairly thin, and so the width of the line is the same. Now loading up your brush with paint. The other way you can do lines is by sweeping your brush across the paper. Here you can see how I'm holding my brush perpendicular to the line that I would like to draw. If I press down my entire brush and sweep it through, the line is much more thicker. Whereas if I use only a little bit of that brush, I end up with a thinner line. This is a great way to add thicker lines to your artwork. So gently sweeping your brush across the paper. Let's create a leaf stem. I'm using a thin curved line with some branches. We're going to gently press and release in the form of a leaf. So you can see I press down my brush and slowly lift it up. Press down your brush and lift it up. I am making sure that when I do a second line, I don't overlap it too much, just enough. Because if I overlap it a lot, I might lift some of that existing color. Let us practice another leaf following the same method. For smaller leaves, you can use just 2 lines to control the size. Now I'm gonna do the same thing, but in this I will switch over my brush. So instead of using a size 4 brush for painting the leaves, I'll be using a size 12. This makes the process a lot more easier because the brush width is much more bigger. So when I press down my brush, I automatically end up with a much more bigger leaf. So that is why when I practice my brush drills, I do them with multiple sizes of brush because the effect is very different. When you're doing the left side leaves, it is easier to start from outside and moving inside. Now when I press down my whole brush, I end up with a fairly big leaf, but if I press down only a part of the brush, I will end up with a smaller leaf. So this is something that is very useful to practice. Now using the same leaf styles, let's also practice some more curved lines. I press down my brush and gently lift it up in the form of a curve. I can fill in the center for a much more curved shape. Let's do this one more time, but we are going to do it around a circle. So press down the brush and gently lift it up in the form of a curve. This becomes our first petal. Doing another curve line for the petal of this flower, leaving a little bit of space. We can do another petal with the same technique. And now the final petal for this technique. And that is how you can create some simple flowers. Practicing these kind of curved shapes is very helpful, and you will see massive improvement in your art as well. The next style that we will be practicing is creating curved petals. So I start with a thin line and then I'm pressing down my brush and forming a curve shape. Doing the same on the other side and connecting the two to form a curved petal. Practicing this again, following the same step by step process. Using these petal shapes, we can paint a flower. Painting that center circle, and now using a thin line and then pressing down your brush in a curved shape to form a curved petal. Doing that on the next petal as well. Keeping a little gap and following the same process. Final petal for this flower. The next petal that we can practice is pressing down and dragging our brush to create a longer length and much more thinner petal. So notice how I did a thin line, then I pressed down my brush for a longer length and then gently curved it at the top. Using that style of painting to create some leaves. So adding a stem with branches and then using long leaves to fill it up. play around with the placement of the leaves. These are some of the basic brush drills that you can practice before starting with painting leaves and flowers.